The chandeliers dripped fractured light onto marble floors, each reflection a shard of ambition cutting the air. I was a satellite in orbit, a startup founder circling my success, wearing armor grown heavy. The noise was physical, laughter too sharp, pitches too loud, crystal clinking against greed. I told myself the lie I always did. Just friends, just networking, just business. It was the architecture of isolation I'd built to protect a heart broken once, and I had no intention of letting anyone inside. Then I locked eyes with the sommelier across the room, and the air thickened instantly. The performance of confidence was a muscle memory I'd perfected over 3 years of startup warfare. My shoulders were pinned back, my handshake firm, my laugh timed to land just before the punchline of a potential investor's joke. Each interaction was a transaction, charm for capital, competence for credibility. But beneath the tailored blazer, my ribs were a cage of exhaustion, each breath measured and deliberate. The constant scrutiny of these events had become a low-grade fever I couldn't shake. Every glance a potential valuation, every conversation a due diligence interview where my humanity was the liability. I could still taste the betrayal. 3 years ago, my co-founder and then girlfriend had stolen our IP, lines of code I'd written at 3 a.m., fueled by her promises and cheap wine, and sold it to a competitor for a seat at their table. She'd left me with nothing but a hollowed-out company, a non-compete clause, and the certain knowledge that trusting the soft curve of a woman's smile had been my fatal error. That wound had calcified into armor. Now, when someone asked if I was seeing anyone, I had a script ready. "I'm married to the company," I'd say, or "just friends, you know how it is." The lie was a fortress I'd built around my heart, each just friends, another brick mortared with fear. The physical sensation of those walls was tangible, a coiling in my stomach that tightened whenever someone lingered too long in my personal space, a metallic taste on my tongue when a conversation turned intimate. My therapist called it hypervigilance. I called it survival. My body had become a boarded-up house, windows shuttered, doors locked, the for sale sign ripped down years ago. The problem with fortresses is that they don't just keep danger out, they suffocate the person inside. I'd stopped feeling the full spectrum of human connection, existing instead in a muted grayscale where safety trumped color. The walls had become so familiar, I'd forgotten they were self-imposed, mistaking my cage for a sanctuary. Just friends had become my standard deflection, a phrase I deployed with the precision of a surgical strike. At a conference in Austin last month, a brilliant CTO had asked me to dinner after a panel. I'd smiled and said, "I'd love to, but I'm just friends with someone and I don't want to complicate things." The lie was vague enough to be plausible, specific enough to end the conversation. It was my exit strategy from any situation that threatened to breach the walls. The words left my mouth tasting like ash, but ash was better than the acid of betrayal. By the time the keynote speaker began his second chart on blockchain disruption, I needed to escape. The sensory overload was becoming unbearable. The cloying perfume of a VC's wife, the sharpness of a dozen aftershaves competing in the air, the visual static of name tags and forced smiles. My nervous system was screaming for grounding. I made my excuses to a junior partner, fabricating a need for fresh air, and navigated toward the wine bar at the far end of the ballroom. My feet moved on autopilot, carrying me away from the performance and toward the one thing that had never betrayed me, the predictable chemistry of fermentation. Each step was a small rebellion against the exhaustion. The bar was an island of calm in a sea of performance. Dark wood gleamed under soft lighting, bottles lined up like soldiers who'd never broken rank. I leaned against the cool marble edge and let my shoulders drop for the first time all night. The exhaustion was a physical weight now, pressing down on my collarbones. I needed 5 minutes of anonymity before I could plaster the smile back on and return to the dance of acquisition. The sommelier caught my eye again, moving with a grace that seemed impossible in this chaos, and I felt the coiled tension in my gut tighten with something that wasn't fear for the first time in years. It was a feeling I didn't have a name for, but it tasted like possibility and danger in equal measure. The sommelier approached with a precision that made chaos feel orchestrated. Her name tag read Vivian in elegant script. She was all clean lines and quiet competence, her dark hair pulled back to reveal a neck that held itself with the same grace as the bottles lining the wall behind her. There was something about the way she occupied space that made the ballroom noise fade to background static as she neared. "What calls to you?" she asked. The question weighted with more than wine selection. Her voice was low, a river stone worn smooth by years of current. I gestured at the Pinot Noir section. "Something that doesn't need to breathe too long. I only have 5 minutes." Vivian's gaze sharpened with assessment, not judgment. She reached for a bottle, her fingers wrapping the neck with tender familiarity. The cork released with a pop that cut through the ballroom's din. I watched the dark liquid spiral into the glass, seeming to pull ambient light into its depths like a drain. The liquid seemed alive, breathing. "Complex notes," she said, eyes on the pour. "But it needs time to open up. Right now, it's all tannin and defense." The scent reached me. Oak and dark fruit. A whisper of something earthy like rain on hot pavement. I lifted the stem, and our fingers brushed. The jolt was static electricity, sharp and bright, traveling up my arm and settling in my teeth like a tuning fork struck against bone. I nearly dropped the glass. Vivian didn't flinch, but her gaze held mine a beat longer than professional courtesy required. "You're not here for the wine," she said. It wasn't a question. I sipped, letting the liquid coat my tongue. The tannins were aggressive, pulling at my cheeks. "I'm here because this is the only place where no one's asking for my valuation. And yet you're still performing," she observed, voice dropping lower. She poured a second glass, a different vintage, and set it beside the first. "This one's been allowed to breathe. Taste the difference." I picked up the second glass, careful to avoid her fingers. The wine was softer, rounder, the fruit more forward, the edges carefully sanded down. "It's the same grape," I said, surprised. "Same vineyard, different approach. One was kept too safe. The other was given air and trust." She leaned against the bar, posture shifting from server to confidant. "The first is terrified of being opened. The second knows that's the only way to become what it's meant to be." The subtext landed hard in my chest. My throat tightened around a swallow. "Some wines are better left corked." "Some people tell themselves that," she countered, gaze unflinching. "But everything fermented wants to be tasted. The question is whether you're brave enough to pour." Across the ballroom, laughter from the VC table made me flinch. My shoulders started climbing back toward my ears. Vivian noticed, eyes tracking the movement like a complex algorithm parsing data. "You wear your exhaustion like a bespoke suit," she said. "Perfectly tailored, but suffocating." The observation was too accurate. I set down the glass, the wine suddenly tasting like confession. "I should get back." "To what?" The question was soft, but stopped me mid-turn. More conversations about disruption and scalability? More men explaining your own industry to you? I looked at her then, past the professional veneer. In the low light, her eyes were the color of good whiskey held to flame. Amber and depth, and something ancient, promising warmth if you were brave enough to drink. She wasn't asking me to stay. She was asking me to admit why I wanted to. "The second wine," I said, voice quieter than intended. "How long did it need to breathe?" "Longer than it wanted to admit," she replied, a small smile playing at her mouth's corner. But the wait was worth it. Another guest approached the bar, a man in a suit that cost more than my first car. Vivian straightened, the confidant disappearing behind the professional mask so quickly I questioned if I'd imagined her. But as she moved to serve him, her hand brushed mine again, deliberate pressure that lasted exactly 1 second before she pulled away. I left the bar with both glasses unfinished, the taste of oak and possibility lingering on my tongue. The coiled tension in my gut had shifted, no longer just anxiety, but something more dangerous: anticipation. The fortress I'd built suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison I'd locked myself inside. And Vivian, with her unflinching gaze and perfectly executed grace, had just quietly slipped a key under the door. She was the invitation that I didn't know I'd been waiting for. I hadn't made it 10 feet from the bar when the heat of a presence materialized at my elbow, radiating entitlement and cheap ambition. "A bit out of your league, isn't it?" a voice oozed. I didn't have to turn to know who it was. Julian Thorne, a junior acquisitions broker with the subtlety of a foghorn who'd been circling me all night. He'd already pitched me 3 times, in the elevator, the restroom line, and once while I'd been trying to eat a canapé. Each approach more invasive than the last. I gave him a non-committal smile, my eyes tracking Vivian's movement behind the bar. "I'm just here to appreciate the wine." He leaned closer, his breath hot and unwelcome. "I can help you appreciate other things. My penthouse has a much better collection." The sheer, bone-deep exhaustion of it all washed over me. The polite refusals, the firm rejections, the constant draining performance of unavailability. I was tired. In a moment of desperate, foolish invention, the words fell from my lips before I could stop them. "Thank you, but I'm discussing business with a friend." Marcus's smirk was condescending. He looked me up and down, a predator assessing wounded prey. "Really? I haven't seen anyone with you all night. Don't tell me she stood you up." He was baiting me, enjoying my discomfort. My throat went dry. My lie was a flimsy shield about to shatter. And then I saw Vivian's reflection in the mirrored wall behind him. She was watching us, her eyes narrowing as she cataloged the power dynamic like a complex algorithm. Her gaze flicked from Julian's invasive posture to my rigid spine, and I saw something dangerous flicker across her face. "She's right there," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the bar. "The sommelier. We're discussing a consulting project." Julian turned, following my gesture. Vivian was already moving toward us, her steps deliberate, her expression shifting from observer to actor in a heartbeat. She carried a fresh bottle, her fingers wrapped around the neck like she was considering using it as a weapon. "Miss Thorne," Vivian said, her voice cool and smooth as river stones. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to." Julian's face registered confusion. "You two are discussing a very time-sensitive project," Vivian interrupted, stepping into the space between us with a territorial grace that made my breath catch. She placed a hand on my lower back, the touch a steady pressure that grounded me. "We have a conference call with Napa in 10 minutes. Private business." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so perfectly calibrated, that even I almost believed it. Her hand was warm through the silk of my blouse, her thumb tracing a small circle that sent a jolt up my spine. It was proprietary and protective, a claim so subtle it was almost subliminal. Julian's eyes darted between us, his predatory confidence fracturing. "I didn't realize—" "Most people don't," Vivian said, her gaze unflinching. She didn't remove her hand from my back. "It's why we prefer to conduct our meetings away from the main floor. Fewer interruptions." The subtext was clear. You're the interruption. She was using my own lie, but she'd weaponized it into something more potent, a public declaration that I was under her protection. Julian's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, his entitlement deflating like a punctured tire. "I'll catch up with you later, Lucy," he said, my name sounding like a threat. "I'm sure you will," Vivian replied before I could speak. Her voice was a velvet-covered blade. "But for now, she's otherwise engaged." She steered me away from him, her hand still on my back, guiding me through the crowd with a calm authority that parted the sea of bodies. We didn't stop until we reached the far side of the ballroom, standing before a towering arrangement of white orchids that blocked us from view. "That wasn't a rescue," Vivian said, her voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. "That was a statement." My pulse hammered against my ribs. "You didn't have to." "I know." She turned to face me, her hand finally leaving my back. The loss of contact was physical, but I wanted to. And you needed me to. The truth of it landed hard. I'd been cornered, my professional deflections useless against Julian's persistence. Vivian had seen the power dynamic, understood the stakes, and intervened not as a sommelier, but as a woman who'd decided I was worth protecting. The realization was terrifying. She'd just publicly claimed me, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to run from the exposure or lean into the safety of her claim. "Thank you," I whispered, the words inadequate. Vivian's gaze held mine, unflinching. "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen my consulting fee." The joke broke the tension, but her eyes remained serious. She was telling me something crucial. This wasn't charity. This was a choice. She'd chosen to step into my orbit, to read my exhaustion, to touch my back, to whisper a lie that felt more true than any truth I'd spoken all night. And I was choosing to let her. I tried to rejoin the party. I really did. I circulated through clusters of founders pitching their Series B dreams, nodded at the right moments, laughed at the predictable jokes about disruption. But my focus was tethered to Vivian like a compass needle pulled north. Every few minutes, my gaze drifted back to the wine bar, tracking her movement through the crowd. She poured with a precision that looked like choreography, her hands steady while the rest of the room pulsed with nervous energy. The clean, complex scent of her, sandalwood and old books and something citrus, cut through the cloying perfumes of the crowd like a knife through fog. I found myself circling back, drawn by a gravitational force I couldn't name and was terrified to examine. The second time I approached, she was alone, wiping down the marble bar with a white cloth. She didn't look up, but her posture shifted, a subtle relaxation that told me she'd been aware of my approach before I even knew I was moving toward her. "You're running from him," she said, voice low. "Or from yourself?" The question bypassed all professional armor and went straight for the throat. I set my empty glass down harder than intended. "I'm running from opportunists who think a startup founder is an easy mark. That's what you tell yourself." She set the cloth aside and leaned against the bar, mirroring my posture. "But I watched you after you left. You didn't go find your investors. You stood by that orchid arrangement for 12 minutes, watching me in the mirror." The observation landed like a physical blow. She'd counted. She'd noticed. She'd seen through the performance to the woman underneath, who was circling back, not for safety, but for something far more dangerous. "You're very observant," I managed, the words thin. "I'm very interested." The correction was gentle, but absolute. There's a difference. Our conversation shifted registers then, moving from the safe ground of wine into something that felt like tasting a vintage I'd never encountered before. We discussed the nature of instinct versus logic, of what your gut knows versus what your spreadsheet tells you. Vivian spoke about terroir, the way a grape's environment imprints itself on the final wine, how you can't fake the minerals in the soil or the angle of the sun, how some vineyards try to control everything, micromanaging each variable, and produce wines that are technically perfect, but emotionally dead. "Safety is a cage that feels like a fortress," she said, pouring a taste of something burgundy and mysterious. "You tell yourself you're protecting the wine, but you're just suffocating it." I swirled the glass, watching the legs run down the sides. The metaphor was too precise. My throat tightened around a swallow. Some wines need protection. The world is full of people who want to take what isn't offered. "And some people," she countered, gaze unflinching, "have learned to mistake every open hand for a threat." She took the glass from me, her fingers deliberately grazing mine this time, the contact sustained for 3 heartbeats. "Tell me, when was the last time you let yourself be tasted?" The innuendo was there, but it was wrapped in something so genuine, so observant, that it didn't feel like a line. It felt like a diagnosis. My guard dropped, raw and immediate, and the terror that flooded in wasn't about Julian, or the party, or my startup. It was about how easily Vivian saw through the merger terminology I used to hide feelings, the way I'd learned to discuss relationships like term sheets, all vesting schedules and exit clauses and risk mitigation. She saw the woman who'd learned to treat her own heart like a cap table, diluting her emotions until she barely held majority stake in her own desires. "You use business language to hide," she said, not asking. knowing. You talk about partnership agreements and due diligence because those terms have clear definitions. They have contracts. They have consequences if someone breaches them. My breath caught. And what's wrong with that? Nothing, she admitted, except that you've forgotten how to speak the language of want without translating it into a pitch deck. You've forgotten that some things are valuable precisely because they can't be quantified. The party's noise swelled around us, but in the space between Vivian and me, everything went quiet. Her gaze held mine, unflinching, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt the boarded-up house of my heart rattle not with fear, but with the possibility of opening. She wasn't asking me to demolish the fortress. She was just pointing out that I'd forgotten where I'd hidden the key. The party had reached a fever pitch, a crescendo of noise that pressed against my skull like a physical weight. The DJ had turned the volume up, bass thumping through the marble floors, vibrating up through my heels and into my teeth. The air was thick with a toxic cocktail, expensive cologne, nervous sweat, and the metallic tang of ambition curdling into desperation. My lungs felt compressed, each breath shallow and insufficient. I needed to escape the performance, the scrutiny, the constant calibration of my every word. I needed the terrace, the cool night air, the silence of the city beyond the glass doors. I made my move when Julian was distracted by another investor, slipping through a gap in the crowd toward the terrace exit. I was 3 feet from freedom when his hand closed around my elbow. Not rough, but firm enough to stop me mid-step. The touch was a violation, his fingers hot through the silk of my blazer. "Leaving so soon?" Julian's voice was honey over gravel, the charm thinning at the edges. "We never finished our conversation." I turned, plastering on my professional smile, the one I'd perfected in 1,000 pitch meetings. "I was just getting some air. The room's a bit much." He didn't release my elbow. Instead, he stepped closer, boxing me against the wall beside the terrace doors. His body language shifted from persistent to proprietary, his shoulders blocking my view of the exit. The physical threat wasn't violence. It was suffocation. He was occupying my space, ignoring the boundary between conversation and cornering. "About that friend you mentioned earlier," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "The sommelier. You two seem close." My throat went dry. The lie I'd told was coming back like a boomerang, sharpened. "We're discussing a consulting project. Wine pairings for our launch event." "Funny," Julian said, his thumb stroking my elbow in a way that made my skin crawl. "Because I asked the event coordinator. She said you're not on the vendor list." The panic was a cold spike in my gut. He'd checked. He'd verified. He'd turned my own deflection into a trap. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened slightly. Not enough to bruise, but enough to remind me he could. The boarded-up house of my heart rattled on its foundations, the locks shuddering. "Julian, I appreciate your interest in my company, but this is crossing a line." "Am I?" he asked, leaning in closer. His cologne was cloying, filling my nostrils until I couldn't smell anything else. "Because you seem to be the one crossing lines, telling stories about business partners who don't exist, running away from conversations about real opportunities." I attempted my standard professional deflection, but the words came out shaky. "My personal life isn't up for discussion." "That's the problem," he countered, his voice taking on an edge. "You treat everything like a negotiation. You're so busy protecting yourself, you can't see when someone's offering you something real." The irony was staggering. He was using my own wound against me, weaponizing my past betrayal to justify his current aggression. My internal panic was rising, a tidal wave of anxiety that made my vision narrow. I was running out of professional excuses, the script I'd memorized for moments like this dissolving into static. The physical threat wasn't his body. It was the suffocation of having my agency ignored, my no treated as the opening bid in a negotiation. "I need you to step back," I said, my voice firm but my hands trembling. "Or what?" The question was a challenge, a gauntlet thrown. "You'll call your sommelier friend to rescue you again?" He laughed, a low sound that vibrated through my chest. The noise of the party seemed to recede, leaving only the two of us in a bubble of his making. I could see the terrace doors over his shoulder, the city lights beyond them blurred by condensation on the glass. Freedom was inches away, but he was occupying the space I needed to move through. This was the cornering, the moment when persistence metastasized into something darker. He wasn't asking for my attention anymore. He was demanding it, using his physical presence to override my refusal. My mind raced through options, each more desperate than the last. I could cause a scene, but that would be professional suicide. I could acquiesce, let him walk me back to the main floor, but that would validate his tactics. I could try to reason, but he'd already proven he didn't respect boundaries. I was out of moves, out of scripts, out of the carefully constructed language that had kept me safe for 3 years. The boarded-up house of my heart wasn't just rattling now, it was splintering. Julian's persistence was a crowbar, prying at the locks I'd installed after the betrayal. And in that moment of pure panic, with his face inches from mine and his cologne filling my lungs, I realized the terrifying truth. My fortress had become my coffin. I'd built it so well, I'd forgotten how to ask for help when I needed it most. I needed an out. Not a professional deflection, not a just friends lie, but a real escape. My eyes darted past Julian's shoulder, searching for anything. A server, a security guard, a familiar face. The party swirled around us, oblivious to the microdrama playing out by the terrace doors. I was invisible in a room full of people, trapped by the one man who decided my no was negotiable. Then I saw her, Vivian, moving through the crowd with that impossible grace, her eyes locked on mine from across the room. She'd seen. She'd noticed. She was coming. The relief was so profound it made my knees weak. Julian's hand was still on my elbow, his body still blocking my exit, his voice still pressing against my boundaries. But Vivian was cutting through the crowd like a blade through silk, and for the first time all night, I let myself hope that someone else might hold the key to the fortress I'd locked myself inside. Vivian moved through the crowd like a blade through silk, her eyes locked on mine from across the room. She'd seen. She'd noticed. She was coming. The relief was so profound it made my knees weak. Julian's hand was still on my elbow, his body still blocking my exit, his voice still pressing against my boundaries. But Vivian was cutting through the crowd with that impossible grace, and for the first time all night, I let myself hope that someone else might hold the key to the fortress I'd locked myself inside. She didn't shout. She didn't cause a scene. She simply appeared at my elbow, a terrifying calm radiating from her like a force field. Her presence was a physical thing, occupying the space between Julian and me with a quiet authority that made the air itself shift. She placed a hand on my lower back, the touch steady and warm, and I felt the coiled tension in my spine release so suddenly I nearly sagged against her. "Miss Thorne," Vivian said, her voice cool and smooth as river stones. "I was wondering where you'd gotten to." Julian's face registered confusion. "You two are discussing a very time-sensitive project," Vivian interrupted, stepping into the space between us with a territorial grace that made my breath catch. She didn't remove her hand from my back. "We have a conference call with Napa in 10 minutes. Private business." The lie was so smoothly delivered, so perfectly calibrated, that even I almost believed it. Her hand was warm through the silk of my blouse, her thumb tracing a small circle that sent a jolt up my spine. It was proprietary and protective, a claim so subtle it was almost subliminal. Julian's eyes darted between us, his predatory confidence fracturing. "I didn't realize." "Most people don't," Vivian said, her gaze unflinching. She didn't remove her hand from my back. "It's why we prefer to conduct our meetings away from the main floor. Fewer interruptions." The subtext was clear. You're the interruption. She was using my own lie, but she'd weaponized it into something more potent, a public declaration that I was under her protection. Julian's jaw tightened, but he stepped back, his entitlement deflating like a punctured tire. "I'll catch up with you later, Lucy," he said, my name sounding like a threat. "She's done talking to you," Vivian said before I could speak. Her voice was a velvet-covered blade. Then she leaned in, intimate and proprietary, and whispered directly to Julian, her words audible only to him and to me. "She's the one I want, and she's done talking to you." The shock of the statement froze Julian. It wasn't a polite excuse. It wasn't a professional deflection. It was a declaration of sultry intent, a claim so raw and authentic that it rendered his hollow flirting pathetic by comparison. His face went slack, the color draining from his cheeks. He looked at Vivian, then at me, then back at Vivian, and I saw the moment he realized he'd been playing a child's game while she was playing chess. He retreated without another word, his shoulders hunched, his confidence shattered. The crowd swallowed him, and just like that, the threat evaporated. But the claim remained, hanging in the air between Vivian and me like a living thing. She didn't release me immediately. Her hands stayed on my back, steady and warm, her thumb still tracing that small circle. I could feel the eyes of the room on us, curious glances flicking our way. The whispers would start soon, the speculation, the questions about the startup founder and the sommelier. "That wasn't a rescue," Vivian said, her voice dropping to something intimate and dangerous. "That was a statement." My pulse hammered against my ribs. "You didn't have to." "I know." She turned to face me, her hand finally leaving my back. The loss of contact was physical, a cold rush where her warmth had been. "But I wanted to, and you needed me to." The truth of it landed hard. I'd been cornered, my professional deflections useless against Julian's persistence. Vivian had seen the power dynamic, understood the stakes, and intervened not as a sommelier, but as a woman who'd decided I was worth protecting. The realization was terrifying. She'd just publicly claimed me, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to run from the exposure or lean into the safety of her claim. "Thank you," I whispered, the words inadequate. Vivian's gaze held mine, unflinching. "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen my consulting fee." The joke broke the tension, but her eyes remained serious. She was telling me something crucial. This wasn't charity. This was a choice. She'd chosen to step into my orbit, to read my exhaustion, to touch my back, to whisper a lie that felt more true than any truth I'd spoken all night. And I was choosing to let her. The party swirled around us, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. In the space of 30 seconds, Vivian had dismantled Julian's aggression, protected my boundaries, and publicly declared her interest in a way that was both undeniable and irrevocable. The just friends lie I'd been telling myself had been exposed as the flimsy shield it was. I couldn't pretend this was business anymore. I couldn't pretend I wasn't interested. I couldn't pretend that the coiled tension in my gut was anything other than desire, finally acknowledged. Vivian gestured toward the terrace doors, her expression softening. "You wanted air. Let's get you some." She didn't wait for my answer. She simply took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine in a gesture so natural it stole my breath. The contact was deliberate, public, and possessive in a way that made my heart stutter. She was leading me toward the exit, away from the performance and into something real, and I was letting her. The whispers started as we moved through the crowd. I heard my name, then hers. I heard "consulting project" repeated with sarcastic emphasis. I heard someone laugh and say, "Well, that's one way to close a deal." But the voices were distant, muffled by the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. Vivian's hand was warm and steady in mine. Her thumb traced a pattern against my palm, a silent Morse code that felt like a promise. The terrace doors were 10 feet away, then 5. Then we were pushing through them into the cool night air, and the noise of the party dropped away like a curtain falling. We were alone on the terrace. The city spread out before us like a field of fallen stars. Vivian released my hand, but the warmth of her touch remained, a ghost impression against my skin. She leaned against the stone balustrade, her posture shifting from protector to something more vulnerable. "That wasn't just for Julian's benefit," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I meant what I said. The admission was a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was rusted shut. The boarded-up house of my heart rattled, not with fear, but with the possibility of opening. The cool night air hit my lungs like a plunge into cold water after hours in a sauna. The noise of the party dropped away so suddenly it left a ringing in my ears, the absence of sound as disorienting as the transition from strobe lights to moonlight. Vivian guided me to the stone balustrade, her hands still warm on my lower back, and I leaned against it gratefully, letting the solidity of the stone anchor me. The city spread out below us like a field of fallen stars, the distant hum of traffic a gentle counterpoint to the thundering of my own pulse. I gulped the air, tasting freedom and rain on pavement, my nervous system slowly recalibrating from fight or flight to something I couldn't name. "Better?" Vivian asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She'd released my back but remained close enough that her shoulder brushed mine when she shifted. The contact was deliberate, a reminder of the claim she'd made. I nodded, still unable to find words. The shock of her declaration was settling into my bones now, and I was trying to rationalize it into something manageable. "That was effective," I managed. "Julian won't bother me now." Vivian's gaze sharpened, cutting through my deflection like a scalpel. "You think it was a performance?" "I think you improvised brilliantly." The words came out professional, detached. I was retreating into the language of business because it was safe, because it had rules I understood. "You saw I was cornered and you gave me an out. I'm grateful." "Don't be grateful." Her voice was firm, not angry, but absolute. "I don't play roles I don't believe in." That wasn't a line, Lucy. That was the truth. The admission hung in the cool night air between us, a living thing that demanded acknowledgement. I turned to face her, really face her, past the professional veneer of sommelier and into the woman who'd just publicly declared she wanted me. In the moonlight, her features were softer, but no less determined, her eyes the color of amber held to flame, depth and warmth and something ancient promising light if you were brave enough to look. "You don't know me," I whispered, the last defense of a woman who'd built her life on careful vetting. "You poured me 2 glasses of wine and watched me from across a room. I know enough." She leaned against the balustrade, mirroring my posture, but her gaze never left mine. "I know you wear your exhaustion like a bespoke suit, perfectly tailored but suffocating. I know you use business language to hide because it has contracts and consequences. I know you tell yourself you're protecting your heart, but you're just burying it alive." Each observation was a key turning in a lock I hadn't realized was rusted shut. The boarded-up house of my heart rattled on its foundations, but this time, it wasn't fear making it shake. It was the possibility of opening. "I've been watching you all night," Vivian continued, her voice dropping lower. "Not as a CEO, not as a startup founder, as a woman who's trapping herself in a cage of her own making and calling it a fortress." The truth of it landed hard. I had been performing, but she'd been observing. While I was calculating valuations and managing impressions, she'd been cataloging the way my shoulders climbed toward my ears when someone invaded my space, the way my fingers trembled when I set down a glass, the way my gaze kept drifting back to the wine bar, not for refuge, but for her. "Why?" The question was barely a breath, but it held 3 years of loneliness and betrayal and fear. "Because you looked at me like I was the first real thing you'd seen in years." She shifted closer, the space between us narrowing to inches. "And because I recognized the architecture of your isolation. I built something similar once." The admission surprised me. "You?" Vivian's gaze flickered away for the first time, toward the city lights. "After my divorce. I threw myself into wine, into certifications, into being the best sommelier in the city. I told myself I was building a career, but I was really building walls. Every bottle I mastered was another brick. Every certification was another lock. I became so good at being untouchable that I forgot how to be touched." She turned back to me, her eyes dark with memory. "Then one night, at an event like this, a woman looked at me the way you did, like I was a door she wanted to walk through but was terrified to open. And she said something that changed everything. You can keep building, or you can start living. You can't do both." The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken truth. The tension had shifted, morphing from fear of exposure to fear of the intensity of the connection itself. This wasn't about Julian anymore. This wasn't about the party or the startup or the just friends lie. This was about two women who'd built fortresses around their hearts, recognizing the architecture of each other's prisons. "I'm not her," I whispered, terrified of the implication that I might be ready to walk through that door. "No," Vivian agreed, her gaze unflinching. "You're you. And I'm not offering you a rescue or a performance. I'm offering you a choice." She took my hand, her fingers interlacing with mine in the moonlight. "You can go back inside. Tell yourself this was just a moment and keep building your walls. Or you can stay out here with me and see what happens when two people stop performing and start being." Her hand was warm and steady in mine. The city lights blurred into a watercolor backdrop. The party's noise was a distant hum. There was only the enclosed space of the terrace, the scent of rain and possibility, and her intense, unwavering gaze. I felt the fortress I'd built suddenly feel less like protection and more like a prison I'd locked myself inside. And Vivian, with her unflinching honesty and perfectly executed grace, had just quietly slipped a key under the door. She was the invitation I'd been too terrified to admit I'd been waiting for. The choice was mine. The fear was real, but the pull was stronger. I tried to rebuild the wall, brick by familiar brick. "I can't do this," I whispered, pulling my hand from hers. "It's complicated. My company is in a critical funding round. My investors need stability, not scandal. I have a board that scrutinizes my every move." The words tasted like ash, familiar excuses I'd perfected in 1,000 mirror rehearsals. Each reason was a brick mortared with fear, a lock on a door I'd forgotten how to open. My hands trembled as I listed the obstacles: my reputation, my startup's valuation, the male-dominated VC world that already viewed me as a liability for being young and female. "One whisper of a personal life and they'll question my focus," I said, voice rising. "They'll ask if I'm serious about the company or just playing house." Vivian didn't argue. She didn't counter with logic or pressure. Instead, she reached for the bottle of wine she'd brought to the terrace, pouring a small amount into a fresh glass. "This is a Barolo," she said, voice quiet and steady. "Nebbiolo grapes, grown in Piedmont. The wine is legally required to age at least 3 years before release. Most producers age it for 10. She swirled the glass, the legs running slow and thick. "The winemakers could keep it safe, lock it in perfect temperature control, never expose it to oxygen, never risk a flaw. It would stay technically perfect forever, but it would never become what it's meant to be. It would turn to vinegar eventually, suffocated by its own protection." She set the glass in my hand, her fingers lingering on mine. "You think you're protecting yourself by keeping everything corked, but you're just turning to vinegar, Lucy. The world isn't tasting you. You're not aging into complexity. You're just waiting. And waiting isn't living." The metaphor landed like a key turning in a rusted lock. My throat tightened around a swallow. "Some wines need protection. And some people," she countered, gaze unflinching, "have learned to mistake every open hand for a threat. You've forgotten the difference between a thief and a sommelier." She stepped closer, the space between us narrowing to inches. "Stop acting like a sack of feed waiting to be moved. Make a choice." The challenge was a gauntlet thrown, but wrapped in such profound empathy that it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like permission. Permission to stop performing, to stop protecting, to stop treating my heart like a term sheet with liquidation preferences and clawback clauses. My voice cracked when I finally spoke. 3 years ago, my co-founder was also my girlfriend. We built the company from my kitchen table. She was the CTO, I was the CEO. We were going to change the world together. The words were shards of glass, cutting my throat on the way out. She was the one who taught me to code, who believed in me when no one else did. I trusted her with everything, my IP, my equity, my heart. Vivian's expression didn't change, but her posture shifted, becoming more grounded, more present. She was listening with her whole body. 6 months before our Series A, she met an investor at a party like this one. He promised her a better valuation, a faster path to unicorn status. She copied our entire code base, our patent applications, our investor list. She left me with a non-compete clause and a company that was just an empty shell. My hands were shaking so violently I had to set down the wine glass. She said my just friends approach to business was naive, that in the real world, you take what you want or someone else will. The silence that followed was heavy, not with judgment, but with understanding. Vivian didn't rush to fill it with platitudes or reassurances. She simply waited, her gaze steady, her presence a steady pressure that held me upright. "That's why I built the walls," I whispered. "That's why just friends became my shield. Because if you don't let anyone in, they can't steal from you. They can't leave you with nothing." Vivian reached out then, not to take, but to give. She placed her hand over mine, her skin warm and steady. "I'm not here to take," she said, voice quiet and absolute. "I'm here to share. There's a difference." The distinction was subtle but seismic. My past betrayal had taught me that love was a transaction, that partnerships were zero-sum games, that vulnerability was a liability on the balance sheet. Vivian was offering something else entirely. A collaboration, not an acquisition. A partnership of equals, not a takeover. Her thumb traced a slow circle on the back of my hand. "The wine needs air to breathe," she said again, softer this time. "But it also needs someone who understands its value, someone who won't rush it, won't force it, won't drink it before it's ready." The metaphor had shifted. She wasn't the thief, she was the sommelier, and I was the wine that had been kept too safe for too long, terrified of being opened, but dying from the lack of air. My fingers tightened around hers, the first voluntary touch I'd initiated all night. "I'm terrified," I admitted, the words raw and honest. "Good," Vivian said, a small smile touching her lips. "That means you're still alive." The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken truth. Vivian's hand was warm over mine, her thumb tracing a slow circle that felt like a question. The city lights blurred into a watercolor backdrop. The party's noise was a distant hum. There was only the enclosed space of the terrace, the scent of rain and possibility, and her intense, unwavering gaze. I felt the fortress I'd built suddenly feel less like protection and more like a prison I'd locked myself inside. And Vivian, with her unflinching honesty and perfectly executed grace, had just quietly slipped a key under the door. The choice was mine. The fear was real, but the pull was stronger. Vivian lifted her hand, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw with a touch so tender it made my soul ache. The contact was electric, a map of tension being erased. I closed my eyes, letting the sensation wash over me. Her touch was a question, an offering, a quiet surrender. It was slow and deliberate, tasting of possibility and longing so profound it felt like coming home. My breath hitched. The walls I had so carefully built, the fortress I had hidden inside for so long, didn't just crumble. They dissolved into dust. I realized the safety of isolation was actually a slow death, a suffocation of everything that made me alive. I had been so busy protecting my heart that I'd forgotten how to let it beat. I opened my eyes to find Vivian watching me, her gaze unflinching and full of quiet understanding. She wasn't pressuring me. She was simply waiting, her hand still on my jaw, her thumb tracing a slow arc against my skin. The choice was mine. The risk was mine. But she was offering to share it. I leaned in, bridging the gap between us. The proximity was overwhelming, the heat of her body a physical thing. I could feel her breath against my lips, could taste the wine and the rain and the night. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird beating against its cage. But this time, it wasn't fear making it race. It was hope. "I'm not just a friend," I whispered, the words raw and honest. "I'm not a consulting project. I'm not a business arrangement. I'm a woman who wants to be tasted, not kept corked. The admission was a key turning in a rusted lock. The boarded-up house of my heart rattled on its foundations. But this time, it wasn't fear making it shake. It was the possibility of opening. Vivian's hand tightened on my jaw, not rough, but with a certainty that made my knees weak. "I know," she whispered back. "I've known since you first looked at me across that room and the air thickened." The near kiss hung between us, a precipice we were both poised on. The sensory details were overwhelming. The heat of her breath, the scent of sandalwood and rain, the coiled tension finally snapping into a hum of belonging. We were two women who'd built fortresses around our hearts, recognizing the architecture of each other's prisons and choosing to walk out together. "Let's leave," I said, the words a decision. "Let's leave this party, this performance, this script. Let's go somewhere we can be." Vivian's smile was slow and genuine, the first real smile I'd seen on her face all night. "I know a place. It's quiet. No pitch decks, no valuations, just air." We turned back toward the ballroom, but this time we walked through it together, our hands clasped, our shoulders touching. The crowd parted for us, not because we were performing, but because we were present. The whispers started, but they were distant, muffled by the thundering of my own pulse in my ears. There was only the enclosed space of our shared focus, the scent of possibility, and the woman whose hand was warm and steady in mine. The final image was simple. The two of us exiting the venue, the city lights blurring into a backdrop for our shared focus. The difference between protecting your heart and burying it had never been clearer. One was an act of love. The other was an act of fear. I chose love. I chose to step out of the theater and write a new play with no script, no audience, just a quiet hope for an authentic connection. The fortress I'd built wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cage, and Vivian had been the key I'd been too terrified to use. If you've ever found the courage to drop your guard for the right person, subscribe and share your story in the comments.